If it's hump day, it's hemp day. Welcome to this week's episode. I'm Robert Colangelo, and I'll be your moderator for today. Dr. Nick Nanadovich and Dr. Anthony Levenda co-founded Hemplet Farms because of their desire to heal people and because of their devotion to the research and development of cannabinoids as an alternative to opioids in treating pain. So this is going to be, I think, a very different presentation than we usually have because we're going to focus more on the demand side of the market. How do we get more people to use CBD by improving the science behind the claims that are made out there and looking at how can we hit into a portion of that opioid market and be a replacement for some of those. The two doctors' presentations going to include a discussion of the opioid epidemic, benefits of CBD as an alternative treatment, and the need for scientific research to look at the cause and effect between different CBD varieties and ailments. I'm really honored to introduce my partners in Hemplet Farms, Dr. Nick Nanadovich and Dr. Tony Levenda. Both are orthopedic surgeons practicing at the Lakeshore Bone and Joint Clinics in Northwest Indiana. And I'm going to hand it over to them to have them start their presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Nanadovich, and this is actually one of my partners in practice as well as the company of Hemplet. We wanted to say thank you for joining us, and hopefully what we present here will at least have some significant benefit and educational value to the hemp industry, especially from a perspective of what we do on a daily basis. So the talk we're going to give today is the sort of medical perspective on hemp and where this may play a role in creating some demand for hemp and CBD and its substances that they're isolating and distilling from the plant itself, and the need for clinical trials. And can hemp be a solution to the opioid crisis that has really plagued particularly the United States in the past 20 years? I mean, since the turn of the millennium, there has been a huge uptick in the amount of opioids prescribed and taken and used, particularly in the United States, and I'll allude to more of that a little later in the talk. When you see some of these numbers, it's quite staggering, actually. But one of the things that really interested both myself and Dr. Levenda is potential substitutions or alternatives for opioids and where hemp can play a role in CBD for those uses. So a little background about ourselves. Why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Anthony Levenda. I've known Dr. Nanadovich for 20 years. We were residents at University of Chicago. He went on to specialize in orthopedics and spine, care of the lumbar, cervical area. I went on to do training in sports medicine, where I treat athletes primarily, or a younger population with orthopedic issues like joint pain. So I do total knees, total shoulders. So we both deal with pain meds all of the time. And that's where our interest lies with CBD.
And you'll see that, with what we do and some of the statistics that we'll provide you, it's quite imperative that we look to find some alternatives for opioid prescriptions, just be a better option in many ways due to side effects and difficulties with patients. We'll go through some of that material here regarding some of our patients' anecdotal experiences of trying to get off of it and their experiences also with CBD as well. So the themes we're going to cover is the opioid crisis, talk about clinical trials in general, describe what they are, what they mean, what the needs are for clinical trials and why that's important, and how that'll affect the hemp market as far as the demand's concerned, meaning that the trials will help us to determine what's working, what's not, and in what form, and then that can hopefully help us to help the industry get more information on where they need to go, particularly with production and distillates and isolates, and what avenues to pursue. And that has to do with the supply chain cooperation of, once you get clinical trials giving us information, then we can feed that back to potentially the geneticists to create more useful crops as far as what the products are and what's needed out there. So a basic overview of kind of the topics we're going to cover. We talked about our interest and motivation, how we're interested in hemp and particularly CBD, and what it may provide as an alternative to the opioid crisis and some things we deal with on a regular basis. And in orthopedics, we're fixing bones, right? Joints, bones, spines, decompressing pinched nerves, fixing, dislocated joints. There's a lot of pain that goes along with what we do. It's just, there's no way around it. It's unfortunate. So we try to minimize that impact as much as possible, but we end up dealing with, patients that have pain because these things need to be addressed and fixed. And to alleviate that pain, opioids have been a traditional source for pain management and trying to minimize the length of time we use them. But at the same time, you definitely need them for some of these issues. If you have a broken leg, it's going to hurt. So you're going to need that pain medication. So we're seeing if there are other options to help supplant the use of opioids. I'm going to go over a brief history of opioids.
Not to interrupt, but also our non-surgical patients. Majority of our patients are non-surgical. Yeah, we take care of broken bones or, certain ruptured discs in the back or an ACL tear, but majority of our patients are non-operative, and they're looking for something. And most patients don't want to be on an opioid, which is Tylenol 3, Vicodin, Norco,
Absolutely.
Those kind of things. Those are examples. But sometimes we don't. Right now, we don't have a lot of options, and that's what we're looking for.
So I'll give you a little history of opioids and where it came from and what that even means, what an opioid is. Then talk about the different types of clinical studies and what that means and what are clinical studies. Potential uses of CBD, some of the articles that have been produced, which are not high quality articles as we term them based on the type of study that it is. And then the challenges to the CBD industry that we're looking to overcome and move forward with, again, in increasing demand and acceptance and potential uses of CBD and hemp. So, interesting motivations, the alternatives to opioids, supplements, trying to lower dosages of the medications, even if we can combine some of the medications or the use of CBD with opioids, that'll be helpful. It's just the more of the opioids that you're on or a need or require based on if it's surgery or if it's an injury, the harder it becomes to come off of it. Also, there's different strengths of opioids, and the higher the strength of opioid that you've been on or have required, the harder it is to come down off of it. So that has a significant challenge to providers trying to get patients to wean off the medications. So we've had a lot of experience with prescribing opioids and a lot of interaction with some of our patients. And just to give you a firsthand experience, two of my patients, actually, one of them had multiple spine surgeries for a problem. The first one was a trauma, had a broken spine, had to have that fixed and had other problems and multiple surgeries. Parts of those surgeries had failed and had to reconstruct all that to get it to do what it's supposed to do again and heal up. And I talked at length with this particular patient. And at one point, at about 6 months after surgery, when he still had been using opioids, he actually came in to tell me, he says, "Listen, doc, this is off the record, but I've been using CBD or I've been using THC, depending if it was smokable marijuana or medical marijuana. But even the CBD said, I don't use opioids anymore." He goes, "I don't need it." He goes, that stuff is a monster. He goes, coming off of that stuff, the side effects that he was dealing with, and becoming less and less effective as time goes on, which we call tolerance, is a big problem. And he was done with all that and just using CBD. He says, "This is the best I've felt in years, and I'm not compromised. I don't have the side effects of those pills, which are numerous." We'll go over some of that. And was able to really regain a quality of life that was actually quite impressive, which really piqued my interest in this as well. And then the second patient, which is actually a close family friend of ours, I had done spine surgery for him a while back as well. He didn't have too much of an issue coming off the opioids at that time and was able to wean off relatively easily, but then developed prostate cancer and metastatic prostate cancer a few years later. And he says that the use of CBD was much more helpful than the medication. And these are heavy medications like, morphine or fentanyl patches that he was using to try and get the pain under control. So, I think there's, as Dr. Lavenda said in the past, where there's smoke, there's fire. So there's definitely some advantages, and I think some significant potential for use of CBD to supplant these issues that we're encountering with opioids.
Yeah, my own experience through patients and talks is my first patient was a 70-year-old woman who had a total knee. She developed some tendonitis afterwards. She was on pain meds. She was on pain medication prior to her surgery given by her family doctor. So coming off pain medicines after surgery was a big deal. She was in her 70s. Her son lived right next door to her, and she admitted to using THC at that time and said it helped. She didn't need to be on pain meds. She'd once in a while with her son. At that time, I was a little shocked and surprised because I've known the lady my whole life. But it sparked my interest. And then I was at several orthopedic meetings, and several of the doctors, one was from California, gave an excellent lecture on the use of CBD and THC to treat his patients. And that really sparked an interest. And over the last several years, as Dr. Nadovich mentioned, patients will say, don't put this in the chart, don't put this in the chart. They have concerns, as we all did early on. But it's becoming more and more prevalent, more and more accepting. More and more patients are using it as an alternative on their own. Especially in my world, I take care of a lot of younger patients. A lot of them are healthier because of the sports side of what I do. They don't want to be on prescription medicine. They want to do it on their own, and they see CBD as a opportunity to do that. So I have a lot of interest right now in finding out what is the proper medicine or CBD for each patient we treat.
So just to give you a little bit of background about the history of opioids, I'll just hit some of the salient points of the introduction of opioids. So what is an opioid? An opioid is actually a product or chemical substance that comes from the poppy plant. And when it's the oil that comes from it is distilled from the actual poppy plant is called opium. Okay, and so an opioid is either a derivative of opium. The natural version of that would be heroin, or morphine. Those are natural derivatives of opium, which is that thick tar or oily substance that comes from a poppy plant that can be further refined to these other products. And then there are synthetic versions of opioids. So there's the natural versions, again, the morphine and the like heroin. And then there's the synthetics, which are like your Vicodin and your oxycodones and your Percocet, which are synthesized in labs, basically that affect the same sort of receptors that in our body, pain receptors, that like morphine and heroin do. So back in 1775, opium comes to the United States. About 100 years later, with, I guess, further research, Bayer ends up selling heroin, OTC, which means over the counter, as a pain remedy and a cough suppressant. So back at that time, heroin was sold over the counter. So pretty impressive. I mean, unthinkable to some extent. Eventually, that was restricted to prescriptions down the road and then made illegal altogether. But for research purposes, 1976, we have synthetic versions that come about, which is not that long ago, about 45 years ago, Percocet and Vicodin approved by the FDA. And then 1998 is the big change that came in with prevalence of OxyContin and the studies that were showing that this was a very safe opioid and whatnot by Purdue Pharma. Now, Purdue Pharma is not the same as Purdue University. This is a pharmaceutical company that has absolutely no connection with the university whatsoever. This company comes out of Connecticut, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Out of Connecticut. So they spent $207 million in those at that time. So you're talking 20 years ago on marketing this particular drug. And then we saw prescriptions increase because they pushed what was called a fifth vital sign then, instead of it being blood pressure, how fast you're breathing, your pulse rate, and your temperature. They added pain ratings as part of the fifth vital sign, which then required doctors to start treating pain much more aggressively. And as a result, you see that in this bottom section down here, morphine prescriptions went up 73% in that 5-year span. Dilaudid or hydromorphone went up 96%, fentanyl up 226%, and oxycodone up 402%. So you can really see this is a pretty exponential curve in increase in the prescriptions of opioids at that time. And then so if we look at the U.S. opioid market by application, pain relief being in blue here, which is the vast majority of the lion's share of what it's used for, has grown significantly from 2013 to 2024, expected in the next 4 years. Some uses for anesthesia, cough suppression, but by far the pain management side of things is the lion's share, and 80% of what we're seeing with regards to the use of opioids. So a little more about the opioid epidemic, just that you guys can see this. So there's about 500,000 ER visits per year for misuse of prescribed pain medication. Now, this isn't illicit, medications like cocaine, or if it's crack or meth and things like that. This is actual prescription pain medications. These are prescribed medications. What we find out is, ortho doctors we deal with a lot of pain for patients that have injuries. We're 2.5% of total doctors, yet we're 8% of the narcotics prescriptions, because we tend to have more of a painful population with these injuries. So it tends to make sense. What is interesting, of the written scripts and the patients that show up in the ER, greater than 75% of these are diverted. That doesn't mean they're sent to another ER. That means they are there taking somebody else's medication. Greater than 75% of people are actually taking pills that were not prescribed to them. Either it's a parent or a friend or got them from elsewhere, but those are not their medication. And then we've looked at studies that patients, the risk of addiction, somewhere between 3 and 45%, which is not a small number. I mean, that's a pretty significant percentage. And then we do know that if you're on medications for more than 3 months, you have a 50% potential of being on pain medications for 5 years, for still using them at 5 years, which is quite a staggering statistic. So, and learning this information, you realize how dangerous this actual epidemic really is. And this is just the United States, right? So we're going to go on to the opioid crisis in some of the other countries, looking at the one far to the right, and guess who that is? Again, that's the United States, right? So we've got by far the lion's share of the opioid use throughout the world. And it has come down, looking from the red to the blue. There has been some improvements due to the installation of some of the parameters and regulations now being touted in this country. If we look at U.S.'s use versus the Netherlands of medications, we get about the same patient satisfaction after surgery, and patients report satisfaction with their pain control. And in the Netherlands, they're using NSAIDs, which are like ibuprofen, Advil, Aleve, aspirins, and tramadol, which is a very, very light pain medication. It is still a narcotic or an opioid, but it's one of the lightest that there is. In the United States, we tend to be more reliant on hydrocodone or Vicodin or Norco, and oxycodone or Percocet is another name for that.
I mean, there's a lot of reasons for this. Our ability to write prescriptions, Purdue Pharma's marketing, over $200 million back in 2000, the fifth vital sign, all those things, patients come in and say, you have to treat my pain. It's real, which it is real, but it became, that's part of the epidemic.
Yeah, part of them requiring and recommending we treat pain much more aggressively. So a lot of it has to do with how much, you have to kind of counsel the patient. A lot of this has to do with psychology from our standpoint of understanding you're going to have some pain. It'll get better as time goes on. So it makes a difference with regards to their expectations and setting that level of expectation. So this is kind of the most important take-home point about the epidemic. On the left, you look at the number of opioid scripts that are basically prescribed. About 20% of the world's opioid scripts are outside the U.S. 80% of the world's opioid scripts are in the USA. And if you look on the right, the representative population, we're less than 5% of the population. So you're talking about something that's skewed dramatically to one side. We're prescribing the vast majority of pain medication, and we're by far a very small portion of the population. So there's obviously a problem there. So again, this is another opportunity we're looking at of what else can we provide as an option for pain control that's not going to have these consequences and repercussions. Does anybody have any questions about what we presented so far, or do they understand everything that we've talked about?
So I have a question for you, doctors. Can you tell us a little bit about your profession and where CBD and cannabinoids stand? Is there a stigma with your colleagues, or is this starting to become accepted?
I think there was a stigma. There probably is a little bit of a stigma. And I'm in my 40s. If you would ask me 10 years ago about it, I would have had a whole different opinion about it. It was ignorance. I didn't know about it. I didn't research it. I too thought it was the same as marijuana, 10 years ago. But after, you start hearing more about it, and you start educating your patients. I mean, now, my young patients, my old patients, they all hear about it. Some of them know what it is, maybe not the older, but really the stigma has kind of gone away. Significantly over even the last year. I don't see anybody's, no one ever questions it when I bring it up in the office.
Yeah, I think there's actually been a significant widespread increased improvement or acceptance, particularly of CBD. THC maybe not as much because it seems to be a little more recreational to some extent, but does provide pain relief as well. But the CBD market and industry in particular, I think, has gained wide acceptance, particularly in our areas when we talk to even our patients. We even talked to them about, as an option if the opioids are a problem. So it definitely doesn't have the taboo sort of wrapper on it so much, particularly like that we've seen in the past. So I think that's a market that needs to further progress here.
And I think the opioid epidemic over the last couple of years has really helped CBD and people looking for an alternative, because early on when we first started, patients demanded certain pain. My pain is a 12 out of 10, which 10 and 10 is the highest when you rate your pain, but they would say a 12 out of 10, and you had to treat them, and you really had your hands tied because, marketing, the medical society saying you have to treat it, so the marketing was unbelievable, and we were falling right into that trap. And then now you're seeing, if you watch the news and stuff, now that it's all negative, which is probably the way it should be. So it's really opened the doors, I think.
Yeah, and talking to our colleagues, we're hearing that as well. Even nurses have, one of the things that they were required to ask is what's your pain level, and making sure we're treating your pain. And yeah, I get it to some extent, but there's just been so much of an emphasis on it. It's gotten to the point where it's past the point where it makes a lot of medical sense at that point.
So we got two of the same questions. What is the preferred method on consumption for medical patients? Gummies, tinctures, or smokable flower?
That's a great question. I'll give you a perfect example. The gentleman that's a close family friend of ours, he's done both. Smokable flowers seem to work better for him for longer. The gummies or the edibles seem not to have as significant of impact or effect. It seemed to have and that has to do with dosing, I'm sure, to some extent. But just wasn't quite as helpful as the smokable flower that he had related to me.
I think that's where the research needs to be done on different types of pain and why you're treating it. Currently, patients for me, generally, like if they have knee pain, they are using an oil. That's most of the common theme.
So here's an interesting question. A doctor and a nurse mother are very against CBD and THC, and they did not want them to use those because of nausea and pain. Do you have any suggestions on how to present this data that benefits people to the medical industry so that they're more comfortable with recommending the CBD or THC?
Yeah, it's going to have to be, honestly, the way we're educated, right? You want to base this on science and basically sound evidence that something does work. And so we really are apprehensive to recommend and push forth a type of therapy or an option unless we have something to base it on, because otherwise it's just hearsay. Well, we'll try this. It's like, well, there's not a lot of medical foundation for that or any science behind it. And so we tend to be a little apprehensive or reluctant to recommend things that we don't have a lot of science to base it on. You can say anything works. Like I said, we talk about the anecdotal evidence. Okay, let's say we go down that route and then we recommend for somebody to take CBD. Well, what is their side effects? What if they're allergic to this? There's just things that we don't know for sure as far as what to expect. First rule of being a physician is not to do any harm. So you want to make sure things are safe and you have some evidence to base something on before trying to have some sort of benefit from it. But you got to make sure that harm variable or that harm potential is very low. So it's weighing the risks and benefits, and we try to keep those quite low as far as the risk side of things.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation. A number of the other questions I think you're going to hit on the second half of your presentation. So I'm going to hold off now and let you continue.
Very well.
So our second portion of the webinar is going to talk about the research and what further needs to be done in the CBD industry to make it more accepting, especially in the medical field. So one of the things that are lacking, we did a lot of research or literature searches on CBD. There's a significant lack of really good clinical studies. There are some case reports, patient used, like we're giving just experience with our patients, those are case reports. I had a patient, had a knee replacement, had some tendonitis afterwards. She seemed to be doing well. Multiple patients who've used CBD for their pain, after an injury, some review articles. But what we really need are randomized controlled studies. Double-blind studies are the gold standard. So what that means is you would have a test group who maybe you have 100 patients, 200 patients. The more, the better. Both groups, Group A, Group B, they're very similar and whatever they're maybe it's knee pain. We'll just use that as an example. Age, medical history is close to equal as possible, Group A and B. You have one group that's going to receive what we call placebo or, maybe just like regular oil that they're going to put on their knee.
Like a non-treatment.
Non-treatment. It's not going to do anything. The other group is going to get CBD. And then you're going to collect the data. Now, the physicians, say Dr. Nanadovich and myself, we don't know which one each patient is going to get. We're prescribing, we're going to draw out a hat. This patient's going to get A or B. We don't know which A or B is.
And you make A and B look the same, so the patient, you as a physician nor the patient knows what A or B even is. Say it's a gel, a topical gel. They look the same. There's no significant difference in odor or presentation, so there's no way to know who's getting what. It just helps to prevent something called bias.
Yeah, we don't want to miss, because it's human nature to want to have the good results. So the less that you can influence results, the better the outcome you have.
More reliable.
More reliable. So that's what we're looking for. And that's really not in the literature. So some of the obstacles that we've seen because of this, just makes sense. The Farm Bill making hemp legal didn't pass till 2018. So prior to that, it's only 2020, right. 2 years. That's a big hurdle. So they weren't able to do it. And the federal and state laws vary. It's kind of like fluid. It seems to be changing all the time. So the other thing we believe is the pharmaceutical industry is going to be slow to support this. Now, if Purdue Pharma has all their money invested in opioids, why do they want CBD? Or at least right now, you saw the data, you see how much money they're making a year on opioids. CBD could take that away. Opioid market value is, 11 to 18 billion a year. So, maybe they have lobbyists, they've been around a long time. They're going to market a certain way. So those are things that are in our way to promote the CBD.
Yeah, and so you can't patent, a naturally occurring substance. So it's difficult for them to make a market in something unless it's something they've synthesized or something they've come up with as an artificial means or something they can actually control and have ownership over or monopolize it.
And to get a patent, to use CBD as a medical, prescription, as a medicine, it has to get FDA approved, and that takes years. So there's a lot of money. So people, to invest that kind of money, they want to make sure there's some research out there before they do so. So some of the uses that we've all heard of, I'm sure many of you have heard of, we've heard of when we do a literature search, this is what we see. But the research isn't out there. It's more anecdotal, more case reviews. So chronic pain, which Dr. Nanadovich and I treat all the time, arthritis, neuropathic pain like nerve pain, anxiety, depression, sleep deprivation. And if you look at the slide on the right, there are different, types and variants and which one helps which, the problems. Now, when we did studies on this, when we did reviewed the literature, most of the promising research right now, or a significant portion of it, is on epileptic seizures and primarily on Charlotte's Web, which is very interesting. I was not aware of this until I started reading more in depth over the last several months. But I'm sure everyone knows about Charlotte's Web, but that seems to be where a lot of the research was done. Now, this is not as common as chronic pain. So really, if I was thinking what you should study research on, I would think arthritic pain, which affects everybody at some point in their life, some portion of chronic pain. We probably all have some pain, and, as we get older.
Yeah, the market in that for those problems or ailments is astronomically larger. I mean, it's exponentially larger than the epileptic seizure market. Not to say that's not something that should be investigated or treated, but at the same time, just looking at where the markets may be for these substances.
But the story behind Charlotte's Web was, is amazing. So
it's quite compelling. It really is.
So some of the articles we looked up, using cannabinoids to relieve pain in patients with malignant diseases. These are like more of, like we mentioned, review articles, clinical trials, stuff like that.
Patient self-reports.
Yeah, self-reports. And then, so these are good articles. They spark interest, but they need more substance, more backbone.
Yeah, there's not a lot of controls here. So, bias hasn't been eliminated. These are just case reports or anecdotal presentations that people have reported on as potential sources for further research. And this is typically where it starts. These types of trials or where the trials start, or where the impetus is to get things like this started from a standpoint of future trials. So it's got to start somewhere. So the interest gets piqued at a place like this before there can be standardized, controlled, double-blind studies. Those things take quite a bit of organization and take quite a bit of resources to set those up as well. Yeah, do our presentation.
So this is a very interesting slide. This is from 2019 and expected revenue to 2023. This is in the retail industry of CBD, and it grows from 1.1 billion to almost $8 billion. Now, this does not include medical use, not prescriptions or recommendations in the medical field. This is all what's currently out there. So this number could be a lot bigger with more research, more data to support its use for medical problems such as arthritis or anxiety, depression, seizures.
Yeah, entering the medical market has a lot of significant upside and potential. What this isn't really represented here by, we're talking about 6-7-fold increase in the markets over the next 4 years. Again, not scratching the surface of really medicinal and medical uses and potential, like we've talked about with regards to opioid substitution, chronic pain, and other options for treatment.
I thought this was very interesting. These are some articles out of orthopedic journals. And these are very recent. The first one, and this is been very common theme over the last several years, but opioid consumption around surgical procedures. I found this one very interesting. The first article shows that 24 hours before a patient's discharged from surgery, I think they were total joints, like a total knee or a total hip, and they followed their prescription doses they were taking in the hospital. And generally in the hospital, if you need a pain meds, you're going to ask for it. The patient has to ask for it. They don't have it just sitting at their bedside. So when they're discharged, they're given a prescription for pain medicine. You fill it out, go to the pharmacy, get a bottle of it, and it sits on your counter at home. The amount of pain meds increased after they left the hospital. So that tells us that they were, whether it's just out of habit, it's just easily available, but they needed more pain meds after leaving the hospital than they needed at the hospital. So that's part of our problem. And that's why Dr. Nanadovich and myself got more interested in this. We somewhat caused the problem. We need to try to find a solution. And the second article, which is a review article, was just talking about overall uses of cannabis in the orthopedic practice, CBD, THC. It was a very interesting article. I think it was out of the JAOS. But these are becoming more and more common in the orthopedic world, as well as just general medical field, not just, oncology or treating cancer, but all of medicine. We're seeing that, like Dr. Nanadovich mentioned before, where there's smoke, there's fire. So very interesting.
Yeah, we can only do so much with anticipation and setting levels of expectations for patients. But, from a psychological standpoint, understand you're going to have some pain, we're going to treat that. But even with that, you're not eliminating pain with that. You're just helping patients sort of tolerate and cope with it. They're still going to need something to help with those, because it's a painful stimulus. And we use this analogy all the time, what I do with my patients. A lot of times what we're doing is we're trading one pain for another. So the pain they've been dealing with for years, or whatever their ailment is, if they've pinched nerves or ruptured discs and, where their spinal cord is getting compressed, we're trading the pain that's from the neurologic side of things to surgical or post-surgical pain. But the big benefit there is obviously the problem gets fixed, but the second problem, the surgical pain, resolves. You heal, you recover from it, and you go the right direction, get better every day, as opposed to getting worse every day. So, so having said that, there's going to be some discomfort. So we're trying to keep patients as healthy as possible and as comfortable as possible without the implications and side effects of opioids, which can involve, it's nausea, it's diarrhea, or it can be constipation, loss of their wherewithal, especially in older patients. They get
breathing.
Yeah, breathing. So basically respiratory inhibition or suppression can be a very dangerous problem. That's actually when most people die of overdoses from opioids. They've taken too much to the point where they stop breathing. And so that's obviously very dangerous.
And, we keep talking about opioids, but there's other active ingredients in the medicine. Tylenol 3, it has opioid, but it has Tylenol. People, can get a renal failure, kidney failure, liver problems. If they're on other medicines, they can't take it because it affects their blood. If you're on a blood thinner, maybe you can't take ibuprofen and the medicine has ibuprofen in it. And just ibuprofen, Motrin, Aleve, Advil, Tylenol, they're good for certain things, but they also have side effects, and we have to remember that when we prescribe this, or you get them over the counter. And if we could find a medicine or another option for them, such as CBD, that has less risk, then it's better for everyone.
Yeah, it's a perfect answer. You think about it from the standpoint of minimizing those side effects, potentially risks, but providing that benefit. It's a win-win. It really is.
So, future of CBD, what we need. Bottom line, more research, more studies, randomized, controlled, double-blind study, as we mentioned before. We don't know what the most effective dose is for specific ailments, just because, right now I can tell you, patient comes in, I bought the CBD at the store down the road, or I got online, some say it works, some it doesn't. We don't know the dosage in there. We don't know if all CBD is created equal. There are possible side effects, as they're written below. And do they interact with other medicines? And there are some that do interact. And we need to know that before we're recommending to our patients. So that's important.
Yeah, it's more of that science to base our decisions and recommendations on. Just, again, you're dealing with human beings and their health. It's a big deal in the sense of kind of looking out for their well-being and protecting them from having problems and minimizing risks. It really is. A lot of medicine has to do with that. You're trying to help and fix things at the same time. You're not trying to cause a new problem or run into complications, which can be a significant issue.
So, future of CBD, we need FDA approval. Right now, it's considered a supplement. It's not regulated by the FDA. They don't really have an opinion. So they're not regulating its safety or purity. It's kind of like you get online, you say it's CBD, you really don't know what you're getting. You don't know the dose of the active ingredient. You don't know the inactive ingredients all the time. There's other things that are in there that can have side effects, and you need to know the cause and effect.
And considering this is a supplement, this is where we talk the supply chain parameters about what actually is being provided out there. Is this a good quality? Is there purity to it? What's the quality and the level of quality that's being produced? And that's there's a lot of implications that have to do with that.
So I think this is great. I think you need to get the government involved to scrutinize what's out there, to penalize those that are promoting false claims. It's not a cure-all for cancer. It's not the new snake oil. I think the people that are really interested in the future of CBD will encourage the government's involvement to kind of get rid of the ones that are just in it for the dollar, the quick gain, and really don't care about the future of it. But if we stick together, do the research, I think it has a very promising future.
Yeah, the longevity has to do with it being done right. I think that's really what this all boils down to, is doing things right and doing it correctly to have have, foundation and information and data upon which to base a future on. Because if it's just all the anecdotal things, it's gonna sort of head by the wayside, sort of like we've seen with, I don't know if anybody's heard of the supplements of glucosamine, chondroitin, MSM. These are things that they were used as supplements for arthritic pain. There was a big market for it in a short period of time, but then studies that were done that show that it didn't do anything different than the placebo did. When we look at these double-blind studies, and that's market or largely disappeared as a market because it's been shown not to really work. So that's where the research is very helpful. We can show and substantiate that these things are working for these particular. I mean, we're off to the races then as far as the market is concerned, but also having this be an industry that stands the test of time, and that's really what it's going to boil down to.
And like Dr. Nanavich mentioned before, if we do the research and we show that it does have promise in, we'll just say, the arthritic world, or you would be able to go to a doctor's office and say, here's the research, it works, and they're going to be more encouraged and more accepting of it than if you just say, hey, yeah, it seems it works occasionally.
This is what I think. Yeah. So looking at that supply chain and mentioning, this is a continuum or a chain of events, and I tend to look at this more of a circle than a start and an end point. We have the geneticists in the beginning, figuring out what particular genetics are going to produce what type of outcome, what type of product, and then the clinical trials to determine what those products are used for and what are they helping. From that standpoint, then it goes back to the geneticists, that the clinical trials can help determine what genetics are producing the better strains and producing better products, producing better substances from the hemp plant that can have more of an impact and be more successful in treating patients with these other ailments that we had mentioned. So it's very important that these two things sort of interwork between one another and have this intercommunication from the clinical trials back to the geneticists to produce the type of plants with the type of genetics that are going to produce the substances that we're looking for that actually are helpful, as opposed to the ones that haven't shown much benefit in any way, shape, or form, and we're just wasting resources at that point. So it's quite important that there is collaboration between the geneticists and the clinical trials.
So this is a slide just kind of demonstrating some ailments on the left side, and then possible different types of CBD or THC that show promise in treating these problems. So I thought this was we thought this was a very interesting chart. But this would be something you would want to look for, and you'd want research to prove that these things work. So if you had elevated blood sugar, hey, we need CBD. You'd be able to use that, or THCV to suppress your appetite. How encouraging would that be? That would be awesome. Or reduce your risk of arterial blockage with THC or a different type of CBD. But it shows you that each one of these need to be studied specifically and separately to see if they truly do work.
Yeah, some of that
cause and effect.
Suppresses appetite. I might be able to use some of that. It's been winter. I'm not doing a whole lot, so I need to get my hands on some of that as well.
Dr. Nick and Dr. Tony, thank you very much for that content-rich presentation. We have a few more questions. In your anecdotal experience, have you found any formulations that have had significant results, such as isolate, distillate, full spectrum, or broad spectrum compilations?
We've not had, at least I can speak for myself, I think for Dr. Levin as well, as much experience in the, whether it's full spectrum or a finite type of product for use. It's more been just interactions with our patients and what their reports have been with just typical CBD usage. What this substance type or subtype is of that wasn't really related to us, and I'm not sure the patient would have known anyways.
Yeah, that's one of the interests I have, is because you all have a patient, and Dr. Nanavich already spoke on this, that got great results from something. And, maybe his patient had a terrible cancer, his family friend, but like I can have a patient with arthritic pain gets significant relief, and then another patient doesn't. Now they're not getting the same medicine from the same area, from the same company. So, obviously there's something going on.
there's a lot of moving parts, and you really need to narrow down the variables, because it becomes so many variables. You don't know why that person to get relief is because maybe that substance doesn't work for them. It's a different substance they may need, or is it because the substance that different people were using are different substances? So, when you got all these moving parts, it's really hard to pin down what helped and why it helped. That's really where this comes in as far as being an important adventure or pursuit from the standpoint of the hemp industry and CBD with regards to these clinical trials.
So what happens if we don't do clinical trials or we don't get FDA approval? In your opinion, what do you think is the timeline for CBD or CBG to become widely accepted?
I think you would have to do some type of research. It may always stay as a supplement, but I think if you really want it to take off, it'd be better to be evaluated by the FDA and get, but I think you would need to have the research done for sure. Glucosamine chondroitin is still around. People still use it. There's hundreds of medicines like that, but when a patient comes to me and says, I have knee pain, it doesn't come to mind right away because there's nothing to back it. And, I have to treat patients with things that have clinical data to back them. I can't just use anecdotal. Then you might my doctor I used to know says, rub ketchup on your knee if it makes it feel better, because ketchup doesn't cause it's not negative, it has no side effects. And it's obviously a placebo, and if that's what we want, then that's what we want. But I think there's definitely promise. Companies are throwing billions of dollars in research in CBD. So we know something's there. We just don't know what it is yet.
Yeah, I think it's going to be required in order to support the industry and establish an industry that has staying power, as opposed to, looking at a specific product that may be a flash in the pan. I think the bigger picture is to really pursue the industry as far as developing and supporting and promoting an industry surrounding hemp and CBD, as opposed to just maybe one or two products. Because I think there's a lot, the old adage is you don't know what you don't know. And that's the scary part. There's, how many cannabinoids 66 the last time I read, and of cannabinoids, there may be more. We don't know. What do they all do? We don't know. There's a lot of I don't knows out there, and the potentials are pretty significant given the fact of what we've seen so far with the anecdotal evidence, case reports, even with the Charlotte's Web, and looking at what that helped with a young girl with seizures 1,200 a day down to 3 a day. That's a game changer when you start hearing some of the benefits of this plant.
With the drug industry being formidable in their capitalization and the opioid market being so large in an area that I'm sure they want to protect, what's your advice for the industry on how do we approach going after clinical trials and high quality testing without having the financing that the drug industry has?
I think collaboration, one is, getting funding and looking for potentially philanthropic sources of funding, partnering with universities, particularly with Purdue University, and doing studies with universities will be helpful as well. So I think those are two very reasonable and viable options when it comes to doing these studies.
I think one of the big things that have made this more accepting is just the voice out there, the people out there that want to see that we can use that to treat stuff. We saw with THC, now, but CBD, I think just people are like, we need better options, and I think opioids have right now in the last several years have such a negative stigma. I think it's helped us kind of get moving, the ball rolling a little bit better. And I think, big companies are investing in CBD research. So I don't think you're going to get as much, and I'm not talking about, I'm sure Purdue Pharma will, if they see the light, they're going to put money in, they're obviously in it for the money. So, but you're seeing like brand names, like, other companies like Coca-Cola, all these companies are looking at it, I'm sure Starbucks, I'm sure all these companies are looking at it and have an interest, so I don't think it'd be as hard as we think.
Yeah, we
maybe
definitely want to.
5 years ago, 10 years ago, I think probably. Now I think it's it'll be a lot easier.
Well, you two are very gifted surgeons. Your time is precious. We appreciate you spending your lunch hour with our hemp community here. From the comments, you've received many positive accolades on your presentation. People really enjoyed it. It was very informational. And I think with you on our team here as the industry, we're going to be able to solve this problem and be able to eat into the opioid market.